we are traditional here, and in congruence with tradition, I wanted Professor Elizabeth Radziszewski to go first, because ladies first. Unfortunately, traffic patterns did not cooperate. The weather is too nice, so I would like to invite Professor Elizabeth Radziszewski to deliver the next paper, and to forgive me that we started without her. She's a visiting assistant professor in the Department of International Relations at Lehigh University, and author of Social Networks and Public Support for the European Union, which came out of Rutledge in 2013. She received her PhD from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. In addition to her research on public opinion on European integration, she's interested in international conflict and civil wars. She received grants from the Woodrow Wilson Center and Council for European Studies, and her work has been published in the Journal of Conflict Resolution, Foreign Policy Analysis, and Political Research Quarterly. We had the pleasure of hosting Dr. Radziszewski before. She was great, so I have invited her back and forced her to read the book, and at least to look at it and include it in her thinking. Thank you very much. Please come and grace us.
Very much for a very generous introduction. This presentation I don't think really fits very neatly with the rest of the presentations here, so I still hope that you will find it interesting nevertheless. The project that I'm working on is about private military companies. Basically, these are corporations that provide security and military services, companies that do so for profit. And this book, basically, it's part of an ongoing book project. What I'm trying to really figure out, next slide please, in this project is what are the conditions under which private military companies can become much more accountable in conflict, specifically in civil wars. And once they achieve a certain level of accountability, how does that affect the termination of those conflicts? And related to that, I'd like to be able to come up with some kind of policy suggestions, maybe thinking about strategies that we can consider for more cost-effective ways of managing the problems of accountability in the private military sector. So just to give you some idea where this book fits into the broader literature, the private military industry has obviously grown in size. There are many companies operating today. In 1989, we only had about 15. Today, we have over 300. So there's been a huge growth in this trend to outsource security services to the private sector. A lot of that has to do with the demand for those kinds of services. The United States downsized some of its forces right after the end of the Cold War. We had the emergence of unstable, fragile states in Africa, in the Middle East, partially due to US withdrawal from that region as well as the Soviet withdrawal. So you had a lot of governments, weak governments left, and those governments started to face threats from insurgents. So they turned to the private sector to get assistance with training their military and to fight the insurgent threats. Yes. So in the scholarly literature, the predominant view is that the private military industry is quite bad for civil wars and bringing the end to conflicts in general. That's the scholarly perspective, and also I think most of the media has a very negative image of those contractors. I kind of step away from that debate and instead, next slide please, I want to figure out what are the conditions under which these companies can actually provide positive services and bring more of a positive dimension to conflict resolution. So the goal is to understand what are the conditions under which those companies can have a positive impact on conflict, as opposed to just generalize and say all private contractors are bad and we should just get rid of them. The view is a little bit different. We want to figure out the conditions that make these guys positive forces for conflict termination. So the idea that the kind of the theoretical approach to this research is to figure out how does the level of accountability differ for companies? And the traditional view is that there is very low level of accountability, that these companies basically operate for profit, that's their interest, and the governments that hire them have an interest, of course, in securing victory or pushing for a negotiation with the rebels. And there is discrepancy between what these companies want, which is to make money, and what the governments want that hire them, which is to end the conflict. So if the companies can find a way, for instance, to extend their contracts, to manufacture new security threats, the idea is that they would go for it, that would be something consistent with their ideology, consistent with their goal of maximizing profits. Since the governments have a difficult time monitoring the companies, many of those companies basically face low level of accountability. And that's where the critique is, that faced with this low level of accountability, we're unable to find ways to make these guys fulfill their contractual agreements and improve the conditions on the ground for the government that hires them. So we depart from this. I use the term we because this project is a joint effort. There's another person who's working on it. Our argument is that the level of accountability is not the same for the companies. And I'll explain how that accountability changes. But if the accountability is high, you can expect that the companies can fulfill their contractual agreement and as a result bring more efficiency to the government. What you will see then is the shift in balance of power in favor of the government and termination of conflict. If the level of accountability, on the other hand, is low, then of course the government's ability to defeat the insurgents will go down, and as a result you may see a prolonged conflict. So really the key factor here is that level of accountability. And what accounts for the variation of that level of accountability? That's what we're trying to figure out in this project. So the factor that I'm focusing in is the level of competition that the industry faces. And the argument is that there are two types of competitive pressures that companies face. One is the industry-wide pressure, which basically refers to this growth that we've seen in the industry providers over time since 1990 up until now. We see this massive trend towards outsourcing. The industry is growing. We see that the barriers of entry for private contractors is fairly low. Especially in the early 1990s, it didn't really take a lot for people to start their companies. A company like Triple Canopy, for example, was started by just a few people, and within a year of their operations, they received major contracts to provide security in Iraq worth lots and lots of money. So if it's fairly easy to enter this marketplace, how can companies distinguish themselves? How can they obtain some kind of a competitive edge to show that they are different, they are better, and therefore more deserving of a contract? So the pressure at the industry level is growing for those companies. And in a moment, I'll explain how that affects their strategies and therefore how it affects their level of accountability. The second dimension of pressure that companies face comes from the actual conflict environment in which they operate. So I refer to this as the local. Next slide, please. Actually, I'm sorry, if you could go back, it's one more. Right. So the second dimension is the local environment, and that's the level of competitions that companies face when they are hired by a government in a given conflict. So sometimes you will see that governments hire just one provider, and sometimes you'll see that contracts are awarded to multiple providers. I mean, in Iraq, we had something like close to 200 companies working for the US government. You go to places like Sierra Leone, for example, in 1995, in the Civil War, you only had one provider. So there is a lot of variation in the number of providers that are operating in a given conflict. And that variation has implications for the type of competition that these companies are facing when they are providing their services on the ground. So the big question is, how crowded is this conflict environment at the local level? And depending on the level of competition, you will see, again, different behavior, different levels of accountability that will have implications for the conflict dynamics. So let me talk a little bit about these two elements of of competition and how they create accountability for companies. So the first one is the industry-wide competition. And so the question I asked before is, well, how can these companies obtain competitive edge to distinguish themselves from other providers? And some companies have chosen to basically change their corporate structure from becoming a privately held company to a publicly traded company. And that gives them an opportunity to secure funding and also to get incredible exposure in the media. So companies consider that a potential advantage, and again, part of a strategy to distinguish themselves from other providers. Now, the downside of this for the industry is that it pushes those companies that are publicly traded to actually be more accountable. So the reason that happens is because companies face pressure from public shareholders. And also, you will see that they are much more under radar from media. The journalists, the media have an interest, especially in following these companies, considering that they are public companies and the public has a stake in the ownership of the company. So because of these two dimensions, the fact that companies are publicly owned and because they have the eyes of the media on them, we argue that the level of accountability that these companies will face is much greater than, for example, what you would see in the context of companies that have not gone public. Next slide. Second element is the local competition. And here again, you will see that there is great variation in the level of competition. If you have more than one provider on the ground, then companies will have a much harder time manufacturing security threats, for instance, or not performing optimally. That's because the competitors are watching them, and given that everybody wants to get the contract, wants to perhaps get the contract extended in the future years, there is an incentive also to, reveal any kinds of mismanagement on the part of a competition. So as a result, when you have more than one provider in a conflict zone, the competition increases, there's going to be much more pressure on these companies to basically provide everything that they can optimally to fulfill their contractual obligations. So pressure to perform optimally, what it leads to basically greater improvements in security for the government, and as a result, more positive impact on the termination of conflicts. Right. So that's the core of the argument, and the way we try to analyze this argument is to we collected data on the presence of private military companies in civil wars from 1984 until 2008, and that's been a very, very complicated process. As you can imagine, the industry is very secretive. So we are looking at whether the company was present in a given conflict year and also in what capacity. We're not interested in the details of the contract. That information is probably almost, I would say, impossible to get because it is secret for the most part. But we can still get information about whether a given company is present in a conflict zone using internet sources, but also verifying information with country experts, which is what we've done, talking to people who are country experts and asking about presence of companies and the capacity in which they were involved. Sometimes we also consulted with non-governmental organizations that have staff on the ground to, again, increase the reliability of this data. But we don't claim it's perfect, so just a limitation for sure there. So the way we are looking at the presence of publicly traded companies is very simple. We're just coding a company's presence as 1 if a company is publicly traded. If company is not, it's just a 0. So very, very simple way of capturing the corporate structure variation. For the local competition, we are looking at the number of providers. So, the largest number that we have in a given conflict is 157. That's clearly an outlier because that's the Iraq War. You don't see that many providers usually, but you may get, on average, 5 to 6 providers in a conflict. Next slide, please. So this shows you just an outline of the trend towards public ownership, and again, this sort of shows that the companies are very conscious about this rising competition at the industry level and are trying to find a way to secure a competitive edge by doing something different. And we think that public ownership is one way to do so. So you can see that the trend certainly goes upward since 1997 up to 2008. That's where our data observations end. And this data shows you the variation in the competition level in given conflict, in a conflict. So this is looking at the local environment. And you can see here that, again, there is variation in the number of providers that you see in a given conflict. Sometimes in light blue you will see those are the cases in which there's just one provider present. In dark blue you will see more than one provider present. So the numbers that you see, these just refer to how many conflicts had more than one provider. But just to make it simple, the key thing to note here is light blue, no competition because there's one provider. Dark blue shows us the level of competition is there. So that's just to show that there is variation in competition and as a result variation in the level of accountability that you will see in different conflicts. Next slide, please. So just some analysis that we did to see how the presence of competition or how the different levels of competition affect termination of conflicts. You can see here that when the government hires just one provider, one security provider, that's the light blue line. Let's say in year 5, right here, the probability that you will see the war still continuing is going to be about 0.85, 0.83. It's fairly high. If the government hires 5 companies, you can see the probability decreases. It's less than 0.6. So there is an impact here with what we argue the level of competition, that it does provide improvements in the efficiency and helps the government make some gains in a way that may have positive implications for reducing the duration of conflict or bringing the conflict to termination. Now, I do realize that when we have more providers, of course, we expect the government to make some gains because we have more companies providing more services. So one can argue, well, it's not just the competition, it's just a matter of pure resource. You know, they have more resources from more providers. So how do we try to figure this out? How do we get about to claim that it is the competition and not just the fact that the government gets more resources? We conducted interviews with employees from private military companies, and we basically try to understand whether those concerns matter for the companies. And many of them, we found in our interviews, expressed concerns about, being at their best behavior when others are there, when it's a more of a joint effort. They understand the risks are there, that if they do something that falls outside of the expectations of the government, that the competition is there to potentially reveal that to the government. Also, the government can compare what the providers are doing when there's more company operating in the zone. So there are tangible concerns there. So it's not just that more companies provide more resources, therefore we expect benefits for the government, but it's also that companies tend to behave more responsibly, tend to be more efficient because they are concerned about the competitive pressure that they're facing. Next slide, please. Actually, if you could go back, I'm sorry. Okay, now the impact of whether the company chooses to become a publicly traded entity, and you can see here again, this is speaking to the variation in the competitive pressure at the industry-wide level and how the companies respond to that pressure. You can see here that when in a given conflict the government chooses to hire a publicly traded company, that's the red line. You can see in, let's say, year 10, the probability of the war continuing is going to be about 0.7. And if you look at the if the government does not hire any publicly traded company, in the same year you can see that the probability of war still going on is fairly high, almost 90%. So there certainly is some gain you can see in terms of the probability of conflicts ending sooner when you hire a publicly traded company as opposed to a private company. So we think that this offers some benefits for the government, and we have some suggestions for policymakers and how to make the industry more accountable. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we suggest is that all the efforts so far that the government has done to try to regulate the industry, they have not been very efficient. There have been some regulatory mechanisms, some acts that require private military companies to register with the government to obtain license if they want to operate in different countries, provide services to those countries. Most of these efforts do not really help increase the level of accountability. Just because you get a license to, let's say, provide military protection to a government in Equatorial Guinea doesn't say anything about, which is actually true, it did happen. It doesn't really say anything about how the companies will behave once they're there. There is no mechanism to account for their behavior once they arrive to a conflict zone. So that's what the problem is. So in Iraq, for instance, embassy workers were asked to actually monitor what the companies were doing. And you can imagine the problems with that, having embassy workers actually going into conflict zone and trying to figure out if the contractors are behaving properly. So a lot of these mechanisms just don't work, and we haven't really figured out ways to increase accountability. So what we propose is that actually the market helps to regulate the companies. If you think about it, all the government has to do is choose to work with providers that have more pressure on them. So for instance, publicly traded companies are expected to behave more professionally. The data confirms it. They face more accountability. The government can choose to work with these companies. The other implication is, if you consider the competitive pressure at the local level, the government can choose to divide contracts among several providers. Right? That's probably the easiest way to go about it, as opposed to giving the bulk of the money and a big contract to one provider. It may be easier to do that, but if you're aiming for accountability and if you're aiming for efficiency from the companies, it makes more sense to divide it among several providers, introduce the competitive pressure, and basically have the industry self-regulate. So that's where we are right now. Just to give you an idea where the project is going, we are interested in, this is just looking at the termination of conflicts, but I didn't say anything about the survival of peace. I didn't say anything about what happens after these companies go. Will the peace be sustained? We have some ideas about, again, how different strategies of these companies may actually have long-term effects on the survival of peace. So that's the future for this project. Be happy to hear any suggestions and comments. Thank you very much.
No. We'll rotate again. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm at my fully pulpit. Please forgive me. I'm not going to rain on your parade. I love the free market, hands-off approach. Freedom is extremely important. But I'm going to ask one question. Are you trying to fix us when we're dealing with dysfunctional governments in horrible places in the world? If so, why? It's not our problem, it's their problem. They are dysfunctional. They're horrible. They are really messed up places. I deal with them because I teach a class on mass murder prevention in failed states. You'll have to grapple with this. Mm-hmm. So you will have to delve into the nature of dysfunctional governments that enable corruption and actually prompt slaughter and mass murder, because they are not Western. Some problems cannot be fixed. I'm so very sorry. Americans like to think, hey, we're engineers. There is a problem. We'll send some engineers. They'll fix it. No, I'm sorry. It doesn't work like that. We can go, we would have to be vaccinated before going, but we could go to certain places and he would be very unhappy. Very unhappy. I understand this is not an attack on the political science theory. It's, I'm being devil's advocate so your book could fly. Because I like the solutions that are grounded in the rule of law and freedom. And this is precisely what you're proposing. I like it. To make your argument more viable and solid, please provide history of contracting. Brief, a few paragraphs. I have just been working as a mentor with a logistics officer, a senior army fellow here at the Institute of World Politics. Once again, he's a logistics officer, and he concentrated on private logistics contractors with U.S. Armed Forces. They do anything from removing feces to building barracks. They're usually not Americans. The companies that hire them are Americans. Most of them do not become involved in combat. And he, initially, our senior army fellow, thought that this was basically all novelty. So I gave him a few pages on prostitutes tailing the Tokugawa armies in 17th century Japan, and camp followers during the 30-Year War, etc., etc., etc. The Roman armies wouldn't have moved without private contractors. By the way, the prostitutes also did the wash, and they cooked the meals. It was an integrated camp, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry to say, of, I guess, fun and games, or at least for the soldiers in the battle. Please look at it. Please look at the nature of contracting. The book I provided for you was about a friend of mine who was great. He fought in Congo and he fought in Yemen, among other things. He didn't fight for money. That is, he took money because he needed to eat, but even though he had been asked to fight in other places, he said, no communists, no fight. He only went where the communists were. And his commanding officer went practically everywhere. Bob Denard was his commanding officer. So after a while, Bob Denard took any job. And yes, it became all about money, and a bit cynical to boot. So I would like you to concentrate on the nature of contracting and explain to us what belongs to logistics, what belongs to combat. Indeed, when you introduce variable solutions with variable parts, competing parts, it may just work. It may work. Some people do the fighting, other people do the feces work. But I have news for you. Nature of war demands secrecy. Private contractors, especially if they're involved in combat, don't like to share. Private contractors who fight must develop superior counterintelligence skills. When they're publicly traded, that doesn't exist. First thing you do when you appear in a place like Iraq or Afghanistan is you cozy up to the locals. That means a lot of activities which are described as illegal by US law. There's the Foreign Corruption Act, and I'm not talking about winning the contract, I'm talking about operating on the ground. Nobody will be sharing anything, or if there is transparency, people die. At one point, at the very beginning, having established its counterintelligence capabilities, Blackwater, in a locality in Iraq, was told to play by the book. They were called in to resolve a dispute. They were called in by friendly Iraqi police. The guys went, they were ambushed because the police was working with Al-Qaeda. And it was apparent that they were going for, they spoke openly about it. And it was vetted by the powers that be, including diplomats. So they went, they were ambushed, and you saw the results. They were killed, some of them were burned alive, dragged on the streets, and hanged on the bridge. All because of transparency. All because we were trying to fix things our way. Because we were trying to make sure that someone does not give us a bad name. We were trying to make us more gentle for the benefit of the dysfunctional ones. Don't take me wrong. I firmly believe that private military companies have a place, and also I firmly believe that there are ways of reining them in, especially if you obey by Christian ethic. In the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, this is the elephant in the Polish question, in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, most armies were private armies. And there was a civil war every other year. This is how it looked. If a portion of the nobility did not agree with something, for instance, a foreign candidate to the throne who was a Frenchman, they preferred a Habsburg, or a Vasa, a portion of the nobility would form a confederation. If the confederation was ruled legal by the courts and the parliament, it was a legal rebellion. It was an expression of taking to the field and parading around, mostly with private, but sometimes also crown armies, or ducal armies from the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. If the rebellion was ruled illegal, it was called a rokosz. Most of the time, the private armies would just parade, strut around, thump their chest, show their sabers, then they would get drunk and make up. It was a sort of a civic duty to participate in those things. So the context of the Commonwealth, legal context that Mr. Spindler-Watson described so ably, limited violence, and there was competition because you had private armies. There was, even if there was bad blood, they avoided bloodshed. There were exceptions, for instance, Rokosz Zebrzydowskiego, the Zebrzydowski rebellion, which was rather bloody by Polish standards. So maybe we should take, and I'm not a globalist or internationalist, but we should take a step back and look at international law and its context. How viable is it? And let me put it this way. Z, yes. Triple canopy, no. And this is an inside joke. Triple canopy is a very bad, or was a very bad outfit. You should avoid it. It was mostly about money and mostly about ruthlessness. The test is very easy. If the owner of a privately held company is an idealist, it usually works out better. If the owner is a cynical bastard, bad news. Bad news. If you find in Africa former South African special forces training post-communists that they used to fight against, that they used to train anti-communist guerrillas against, that's always bad news. It's a bad sign. If in South Africa, or if you find South African mercenaries not fighting on the side of money, then usually things are better. As good as it gets. Because in many places in Africa, in particular in the Congo, you see an integrated calamity where evil ones, local evil ones, take over a diamond mine, a bauxite mine, a gold mine. They kidnap slaves for sex, for toy soldiers and for porters and for miners, and defend the realm while other evil ones attack them. You will have to get used to, in wars like this, and President Obama has promised us in 2008 that he would be visiting, and I hear that a lot of special forces have been flunking French exams. That's really bad news for me. Disclaimer, I have a pony in the running. My girlfriend is an airborne captain, so unfortunately she may be deployed to some godforsaken place. I'll have to undergo the vaccination with her too. So the solutions and theory are great. Then they will meet, inevitably, they will meet reality on the ground. And then you'll have to call me. Now I'm opening the floor for the questions. So I could bring my girlfriend. I was going to embarrass her, but she's not here. She's late.
Yes.
So have you ever, this isn't necessarily military, this is more on the private security on more of a local scale, but in South Africa, the police are so distrusted that most people hire private security, like ADT, you know, your ADT, they have armed guards, or you like press a button, or you call them, they show up, complete bulletproof armor, going, they actually take you out of the house, and then they go, and they, you know, investigate. How the point is that there's this competition, right, that you're talking about, but there's also some sense of liability, and you can change your services pretty quickly. But that just may be something to compare against.
Sure, that would be useful. We have not looked at situations of peace. We're only focusing on civil war, so that might be something else, a different dependent variable that we could focus on in the future.
I have a question about the insistence on publicly traded rather than closely held companies. Wouldn't there be less disclosure, but just as much competition from many privately held companies? I actually agree with the point made earlier. I think disclosure is nuts in those situations. I mean, it's just sort of child's play in a place that's not a child's place. So my question is, why 200 closely held companies do you think will not compete, except that they will not have to divulge from somebody, and that is not far-fetched. The New York Times, what do you do in a village? What if this, what if that? Because that is actually what happens, and then you take it to shareholders meetings. Do you know what they did in that village? And if it's closely held, well, you can help yourself out, and nobody cares. I mean, you know, you can talk about it and do damage. I'm just wondering, why not 200 private?
Because if you have 200 private companies and you, let's say, hire just one of those companies in a conflict zone, you're not going to get, we argue, the same level of accountability that you would if you hire the same company, but it's a publicly traded company. Because they have this media pressure that you're just describing, the consequences, if there's a case of, let's say, human rights abuses, and you're a publicly traded company, and that is revealed by, let's say, the New York Times, the reputational consequences will be drastic for a publicly traded company than for a privately held one. This actually happened with DynCorp, where they were accused of committing some human rights abuses in Iraq, and when the information came out, the stock prices just fell down. They had to restructure. They lost a lot of money because of that. So, go ahead.
I'm wondering, how about effectiveness afterwards?
Effectiveness?
Their effectiveness afterwards, when they're trying to adjust for that.
We actually didn't look at what happens to whether they become more accountable after a scandal. That's something that I think that would be a very good question to ask. But we have some data, but we haven't actually analyzed that. So we think that what happens with the publicly traded companies, at least the examples that we've seen, is that once they're caught and the shareholders abandon the company, many of them actually went back to being a privately held company because they realized the risks, and I guess it wasn't worth whatever money they were getting, and the exposure that might have benefited them initially was not worth the long-term consequence of facing that level of scrutiny.
I guess, I'll just finish and then I'll stop. I I think that is exactly what I mean, which probably means they deemed themselves no longer able to be effective. And in the end, you go there for a reason, to do something and get it done. And if exposure undermines it, if transparency undermines the mission, with all due respect, how? And I mean, what's the point? But anyway, I'll just finish.
I think that's the argument that the private military industry is putting forward. That's their argument, is that if we are overanalyzed, watched, then we can't take the risk sometimes. We find the cases that, of course, you have to find a middle ground, but there are also a lot of cases where companies can be effective and behave in a way that fulfills the obligations of the contract. Some of the cases that we've observed include basically companies creating new security threats, trying to sell new security threats to the government just so that they can stay there longer. The government does not have the ability sometimes to monitor whether the companies are exaggerating or not. So the company can basically claim that the security on the ground, the security need is overwhelming and they need extra time to stay there. The government may trust them because they don't have the ability to basically verify whether that's true or not. So we are worried about these kinds of dynamics. And so on the one hand, you're right, I agree with you that, you know, sometimes companies may have to take the extra risks and maybe that doesn't fall neatly within the protection of human rights and the behavior that we expect. On the other hand, there may be some abuses that could be avoided and companies could still behave in a way that provides efficiency. Like in the case of manufacturing security threats, that's just basically failing to meet the obligation of the contract. Yeah.
Hi, while I agree with the idea of utility or the utility of accountability, my question asks, how would you respond to the concerns voiced by many operators, some of which I know, who view what is often passed off as accountability, specifically pre-executionary accountability, as an unsustainable, restrictive kind of rules of engagement pushed often by non-interventionists that are either wittingly or unwittingly acting as assets on the behalf of, or potentially acting on the behalf of adversaries' strategic information and influence operations. So, you know, it's almost like some of the problems that a lot of us, like more interventionist element, I'm not an interventionist, yeah, had is that certain non-interventionist elements prior to the conventional military phase of Operation Iraqi Freedom got frustrated with some non-interventionists, said, well, don't just go into Iraq, we need to have all these kind of crazy rules of engagement that put my fellow soldiers at risk. Basically, they wanted to find a way to hide in the process to get you to not do it. So, I mean, what would be the response to that concern often voiced by operators, indeed sometimes cited why they went to a PMC and didn't continue their service in the United States military?
I mean, I kind of see that this question relates to, I'm not sure the woman's name, but it's
They're
kind
cousins, yeah.
Okay, I think that kind of relates to this the same level of concern, is that are we trying to, by increasing more accountability, are we making it more difficult for them to get the job done? Right? That I think boils down into the same question. It's possible, but one might argue that if the company is able to operate without regulation, without the rules, they have different motivation than a public army. Right? The public army faces more consequences for misbehavior, for human rights abuses than a contractor. So if the contractors are motivated by profit because they're working for companies that are profit-oriented, their interests may be different than the interests of the government. So there is more of an opportunity for these groups to behave in a way that could undermine the governments. And I guess we have to think about what is more important in this case. And I think the data documents more instances where we've seen contractors that do not face the accountability do things that undermine the government's effort to challenge the rebels. That's what the data is showing. Are there exceptions? Of course. I mean, I agree with you that it is sometimes a blurred line. Yes.
I think I'm going to follow up on this similar line of thinking, but there were some interesting claims made over the past week that the Ukrainian government had hired a private security firm, the U.S. firm, to...
Greystone.
Say again?
Greystone.
Okay, that's what I was going to get to in about 2 seconds. Anyway, as Merrick just said, the company being named Greystone. Greystone was formerly a part of Blackwater, whatever they call themselves now, broke off in a management buyout and went private. So, supposedly these guards are dressed, security people are dressed up in Ukrainian uniforms as special services and are over in some of the cities in the east. Now, the question, I'm just trying to think of the logic here. I guess if I was the government of Ukraine, I would want somebody who wasn't a public company to hire to do this type of thing, because I wouldn't want public scrutiny of what was going on. I mean, I don't even think this thing was supposed to get out, if it's even true, but it was leaked by the Russians. So I'm just saying the logic seems to be, in some cases, the people wouldn't want this public accountability. That's why they might have chosen Greystone in this case. That's something else. But maybe you know more about this.
No, I mean, I think it gets to what Professor Hodakevich was talking about, that sometimes these companies are hired by illegitimate governments or dark governments, whatever term we want to use, and that is a problem, because then they may not want these rules and regulations. We are not here to sort of examine whether the normative focus of the book is not about whether that's good or bad. We are just trying to understand, once they're hired, can they bring an end to conflict? So I'm definitely not going to make claims about the book tries to address these ethical questions, but rather say this is what we're doing. It is purely about, there is a civil war. What can we do to make sure that these guys get the job done for the government? Now, if the government is illegitimate, is that bad? Yes. Will we acknowledge in the book the problem of that? Sure, of course. But the company is not an actor to create political solutions. Their job is to fight. And can they get the job done for the government without basically abusing the government's interest? That's what we aim to see in the...
Just a question of clarification. Are you saying the Ukrainian government is illegitimate?
I'm not saying illegitimate, but certainly the human rights record, the level of democracy is not...
Sorry.
Probably...
The current Ukrainian government, are you saying that government is illegitimate?
No, I am not saying that. I'm saying that their level of democratic advancement is not the same that you would see in the United States.
That's a different question.
Sure.
And one can trace that back to Yanukovych and the
Of course.
Russians themselves,
Mm-hmm.
right? Okay, just wanted to...
Absolutely. Yes.
I think that there is a whole spectrum of companies that provide services to the government. I don't know of any company that provides services to the sharper end of the stick, like Blackwater, XC, all these companies that you're talking about that are public companies. The companies that are public are doing more logistics and training and things that the government has outsourced for the last 20, 30 years, and which our military totally depends upon, and they also provide services to foreign government. A lot of them are owned by private equity groups.
Mm-hmm.
So the range of ownership is very wide, but the implication that you put out there relative to saying that public company gives accountability, well, it may, but it gives accountability to companies that are, cleaning your logistics out, or feeding your troops, or cleaning their laundry. It doesn't give accountability to any of the companies that are on the sharp end of the stick. And even there, I know of no company that actually goes out and fights for anybody. The most that they do is provide either security or convoys or things like that, if they're going to use weapons, or for our diplomats. I mean, the conflict that occurred in Iraq with Blackwater was a protection of a diplomatic convoy. They shot some people up. So no one goes out there on an offensive capability. No one gets hired for that. It's against the rule of law for the most part. So to kind of come to the conclusion that by being a public company, you somehow are going to be more gentle in doing something that you're not doing anyway. Seems a little bit of a stretch in terms of, what is far more needed, I would argue, is the fact that if we look forward, we see that the world is engaged in a lot more tribal conflicts that have been unleashed by the end of the Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union that kind of have kept tribal conflicts to a minimum. But now those tribal conflicts have become more and more prominent, and there's a need and there's an action, whether it's on the part of the U.S. or France or our allies or coalitions, to go in and try to settle those disputes so they don't upset the much greater global stability. Yet we do not have any sort of governance of how we employ the private sector. And if you look historically, the British, which ran a quarter of the globe for 300 years, did it with the East India Company, not with the British Army or the Royal Navy, but with the East India Company. We do not have similar sort of ideas of how we're going to engage the world or engage our allies and our partners to manage conflicts in the future. So I think trying to come up with a solution to say public companies should be doing this seems to be kind of, on the sidelines to what I would hope you would take it to a more fundamental thing. How do we use the private sector? Because the U.S. military or foreign militaries are not capable of adjudicating between tribal rivalries. It's just not in how we are trained, it's not how we are equipped, and it should not be a mission that we should force upon people that don't have that kind of education. But there's a role for the private sector that probably can do that job a lot better. But without an architecture, I don't know how they're going to do it.
Well, of course, I agree with you. I mean, again, no one claims, I think, that private military companies are political actors. They are not, and it's definitely not our argument that they are going to solve all the world's problems. In terms of, some companies do engage in combat. Most of them don't. I agree with you on that point. In terms of helping the government secure victories, the fact that they are guarding government officials, the fact that they are training their armies, the fact that they are providing risk analysis, that's part of, I would argue, the war effort and part of winning against the insurgency. So they don't have to be out there actively engaging the rebels as long as they can help the government forces understand the terrain, understand how to engage in guerrilla warfare. Those still can help them basically shift the balance of power in their favor. So even though they are not perhaps engaging regularly in combat, they can still have a very important role. And there are opportunities within that sphere to abuse the contract as well. So I do think that if you have this higher level of accountability, even in those areas, the companies will be much more careful in how they handle those contractual provisions. Is in the back, please.
I'm sorry, I may make one more point, and that's the assumption that something has to be necessarily public in order to be accountable. I just want to call that before I get into the question. And again, it may be a just a philosophical disagreement, but I think there's plenty of secret stuff that's being done that can be perfectly accountable. And
Thank you.
Yes. You mentioned Sierra Leone 1995. Equatorial Guinea. Was that the same company or not?
Well, I'm sorry, which I didn't hear.
You said Sierra Leone 1995 was one contract. Equatorial Guinea.
No, the different company.
But do you know which one it was?
The Equatorial Guinea, it was MPRI, and the Sierra Leone first, it was Gurkha Security Services, and then it was Executive Outcomes.
I wrote on Biafra. It's at Harvard, Yale, and Stanford. And one thing I did not know when I did that research was the French kept that war alive for so long. And I think Katanga was probably the same thing in the Congo. Private contractors, French contractors. It's a terrible legacy.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councilor Young. Before I invite you to enjoy the food, I'd like to make one more comment for Professor Radziszewski. Namely, the sources are very scarce. Interviews are fine, media accounts are reliable media account, aside from demonetization, are very hard to come by. How many of you know that Blackwater saved the Polish ambassador in Iraq when his convoy was ambushed by the Al-Qaeda? How many of you know? Well, specialists, yes. I'm not asking the German intelligence. It should just be very smiley. Or an intelligent German, I wanted to say. It was French and a Cossack. At any rate, hardly anybody knows that. Because the New York Times is myopic as far as Blackwater. It hates private contractors. The Polish ambassador was ambushed, and U.S. armed forces did not have the capabilities necessary to come to the rescue. They had large helicopters. The ambush was in Baghdad. Eric Prince had small, tiny little helicopters which went to the rescue. The ambassador's bodyguard was shot and burned alive. That's how bad it was. This was curtains for the Poles. Until this very day, no Polish government has thanked Eric Prince personally or thanked Blackwater because it's not kosher. And those people risk their lives. As the gentleman said, they do not have an obligation or a contract to do anything offensive. But they oftentimes get involved, despite themselves, in many places, and they will continue to do so. Now, a few of our friends here at IWP, very few, but they exist, at the Institute of World Politics, have a problem with private contractors. They see it as the death of the Republic. They draw parallels with Rome. They draw parallels with Renaissance Italy, when the condottieri basically installed one ruler after the next. Well, condottieri warfare tended to be fake. There was a lot of war, but most of it fake because they all knew each other. They were friends. Keep that in mind too. Anyway, so sorry. Enjoy the food. Have fun.